As a community, we build empathy, curiosity, joy, and connection when we share stories with you. Welcome to Storytellers Project, part of the USA Today network.
Hi, everyone. I'm so excited to see you here. My name is Megan Finnerty, and I'm the founder and director of the Storytellers Project. We so appreciate you taking a chance on
It's actually not possible to get COVID-19 from any of these vaccines because they are not using live virus.
Short-term side effects that were observed in the leading COVID-19 vaccine trials included injection site pain and redness, fatigue, muscle aches and pains, joint pain, and headache.
When one develops these short-term symptoms after receiving the vaccine, that in fact is a sign that the vaccine is working and that your body is marshaling its defense network.
It's important to note that none of these vaccines can give you COVID-19 since they only express a protein from the virus that allows your body's immune system to generate antibodies.
Hi, everyone. Sorry about that. That was a little message from our sponsor, Humana, and we're excited to have them. You guys know they've stuck with us through the pandemic, and they are sponsoring this 2021 virtual season. And they have a huge message to get out in partnership with their healthcare partners and government from across the country to encourage people to get vaccinated. So sorry that little PSA interrupted our welcome into the show, but it's a live show and these things happen. With that, though, I am especially excited to welcome you to today's show because this is a little bit of an anniversary show for us. Every year in July, we celebrate the USA Today Network's contributions to American journalism by bringing you stories about stories. That's right. Amazing journalists from across our network are going to tell you stories about the ways their journalism has changed them and stories about the way their journalism has changed communities. So they get changed by their stories, and sometimes their stories change their communities and even the whole state. You know that the Storytellers Project is virtual right now because, well, America's like getting back to normal in a lot of ways, but I guess unless you're like a huge Garth Brooks concert, which I had friends who went to recently, we're not like all getting together in rooms and so in theaters and stuff like that. So we're still bringing you shows online, and we are excited to do so. I'm also here with my colleague, Greg Moore, who's a columnist at the Arizona Republic. So I'm going to bring Greg up because he works every day in one of our network newsrooms, and he's going to introduce our storytellers.
Hello.
Oh my gosh, Greg, you are coming to us live from the hot seat.
Yeah.
Hi, girl.
There you go.
Oh, no.
Introduce some people. So listen, this is work from home. And if I do stories about stories right now, I'm going to tell you about how I do my work with stuff like this going on. And I get the feeling that in a few years, it's going to be a really special memory for us. If you could give me 1 second, I'll come back and
I'm on it. Greg, thank you. Oh my gosh, girls, they were fine a second ago. He brought them up. They said hello, but that is just some work from home journalism realness that we're bringing you right now. I'm going to bring up Nathan Bomey is a reporter he covers business at USA Today and recently has a new book out. Nathan, thanks for joining us. Hi. Oh, do you have Nathan?
Hi there. How are you?
I'm awesome. I'm excited you're here. We want to bring up Dana Hunsinger-Bembo. She's a sports enterprise reporter at the Indianapolis Star. Dana, thanks for being here.
Hi, thank you.
Yeah, Noelle Lynn Smith covers the Navajo Nation at the Farmington Daily Times in New Mexico. Thanks for being here. Hi, Noelle. Xerxes Wilson and Jared Whalen will be coming to us together for a tandem story. Xerxes covers courts and county government for Delaware Online, and Jared is a visuals and data reporter at Delaware Online.
Hello, everyone.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much. We really, we generally are thrilled to have you here. I am going to bring Greg back. We're going to bring you guys down. We're going to bring Greg back for just a second. Oh my God, Annabelle, I left you off.
Hi, girl. How are you?
We're just really coming in hot today.
I like it.
I'm so sorry. Annabelle Tomich is a food reporter, and she's going to tell us a long and winding story about how she came to do that from Florida. Thank you so much for being here, Annabelle. I'm sorry about that. Okay. Thank you for coming up. Greg, we're going to toss to you to help welcome people into the show.
Thank you, Megan. My girls and I are really excited to hear some of these stories. So now, let me tell everybody what this is not. Tonight is not a TED Talk. It's not a Toastmasters. It's not a how-to talk. This is not an inspirational speech, an educational lecture, or a slideshow. We won't sell you anything except maybe a subscription, which is good for me because I use the newspaper salary to take care of my family. This is storytelling, and storytelling is based on visiting. You open your heart and your mind, and you pay attention to the person you care about and want to feel closer to. So we invite you to do that tonight. Now listen, some of the storytellers are going to be polished and professional, and others are going to be casual and conversational. Some of them might have a family full of kids who roll up and just take over the video. But we ask you to receive them all because that's how community change happens. We believe that creating empathy and understanding is vital at all times, and especially in times of uncertainty. So with that, let me bring you Nate.
Hey, thanks so much, Greg. I really appreciate that introduction, and your family is really wonderful there. I'm just so glad to be here and so excited to kick us off. I want to take you back to when I was 17 years old. I did a job shadowing experience in high school at my local community newspaper, and they ended up actually giving me the chance to write some stories. And after about a year, they gave me a job as a part-time staff reporter, and they ended up sending me out to the Lodi Township Board of Trustees, where I've got my little faux leather work bag and a yellow reporter's notebook. This was around 2002-ish, 2003, and long before laptops and smartphones, but this was where I would soon learn, at least begin to learn, how a democracy functions. I'm sitting there at these meetings, and it's like, what have I gotten myself into? They're debating septic system zoning requirements. They're talking about the local gravel quarry and whether they should allow it to expand. And it was fascinating. I remember one time there was this meeting about this gravel quarry off-site. There were so many people they couldn't hold everyone into the township headquarters, and these people are so upset. They're debating. There's so much conflict over what to do with this gravel quarry. And I'm there having to, as a young person, report on this and tell this story in an authentic way. I'm not really sure why the editor trusted me to tell this story, but I was there. I was there forming relationships with the people of this community in Michigan, in my home state, where, I was able to just basically perform this public service. And I might have only been college age, but the people of that community knew me. They trusted me because I was there. It taught me something about the importance of developing those trusted relationships between the press and the public, and the role that it plays in our democracy. So fast forward to 2018. I'm actually a reporter now at USA Today, and I moved here back in 2015 after reporting in Michigan for several different newspapers. And my wife and I take a metro ride to downtown DC from our apartment, and we're there to see the National Christmas Tree on the just south of the Ellipse by the White House. It's always so beautiful. It's so immaculate. Every year they put out these lovely train sets that encircle the tree, and they've got little other Christmas trees sprinkled around, and they give every state the chance to decorate. It's really, really nice and exquisite. It's something that sort of feels like transcends politics in a way, but except when it doesn't, because as we approached the area in December of 2018, we realized something was off. People were milling about, and instead of looking up at the tree, they were chatting with each other. And this is when we realized the lights to the Christmas tree were off. We got up to the entrance, saw the sign. Due to the longest government shutdown in U.S. history, the National Christmas Tree lights have been off. And they've been off for weeks, apparently, and we're going to end up being off through the duration of the holiday season. It sort of reminded me of when in Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, Santa says, we're going to have to cancel Christmas because of all the fog. It's like our nation is so divided that we can't even agree on keeping the national Christmas tree lights on. To me, it just seemed so absurd. So just a few months before this, I had the honor to publish a book called After the Fact, which was about our crisis of misinformation. And, as a journalist, I've committed my career, committed my life to reporting the truth, to reporting the facts. And so you can't do that without becoming personally dismayed at how the truth often seems so irrelevant to so many people. It was around the same time that I started to contemplate the crisis that we are immersed in, this crisis of toxic polarization that threatens to do a lot worse than turn off the lights of the national Christmas tree display. It threatens the fiber of our democracy if we can't figure out how to converse and cooperate with people who aren't like us. So that's when I decided I had to be part of the solution. I didn't want, as a journalist, just to sit back and tell these emotionally removed stories. I wanted to get involved in the story and do so in a way that's still faithful to our principles of objectivity as journalists. This was before COVID. I had a chance to go throughout the country and meet Americans who are forging lasting connections between people who look differently, act differently, pray differently, believe differently, think differently, vote differently. I met people like David Blankenhorn. He's the co-founder of a group called Braver Angels, which is a nonprofit that's teaching Americans how to talk to each other again. And I talked to him about conflict, the sort of conflict that I saw back in those early days as a journalist in Michigan. And he said, the goal is not to get rid of conflict. He told me the goal is to try to get people to reestablish a degree of social trust, a respect, a shared respect for our common humanity. And I thought that was so fascinating, that conflict in the end is key. And I also had a chance to meet someone like the Reverend Alvin Edwards, who is the pastor of the Mount Zion African Baptist Church in Charlottesville, Virginia, a few hours away from Washington, D.C., of course, which was stricken by this conflict and this tragedy in 2017. And I talked to him. He's this African-American man who's been immersed in dealing with the legacy of Jim Crow and the legacy of slavery, and now the legacy of 2017 in Charlottesville, Virginia. And I asked him, you're trying to bring people together through this group called the Charlottesville Clergy Collective, which is trying to pursue racial and religious reconciliation in this broken community. And I said, how do you stay hopeful that we can use this conflict in a positive way? And how do you stay hopeful that people can change? And he said to me, I have to believe that people can change, because if I believe that they can't change, that's a belief that I can't change. And that's not something that I can accept. And I thought that was such an interesting way to look at it. He's not looking at conflict and democracy through the lens of what other people need to do. He's looking at it through the lens of himself. As a journalist, I often find myself confronted by this crisis of divisiveness. You see it on social media. I get it in my email inbox. Journalists like me often inundated with unfair criticism that we are purveyors of fake news. And I'm always going to defend journalism against those types of accusations. But I also said I can't tell a story like this without training it on myself and saying, how can I be a bridge builder? And what I learned is that in meeting these other bridge builders throughout the country, the same principles that guided my early years in journalism as a young reporter in Lodi Township, Michigan, are the same principles that we need as a nation to apply in our communities going forward, which is very simply, relationships matter. We can't sit back and get these hot takes and screeds on social media or cable news and think that that's going to solve our problems. No, the relationships that a reporter builds in the local community, or that we build between people who aren't like each other, are so essential to actually helping us progress as a democracy. so this was actually the fundamental theme of the book that I wrote out of this experience, called Bridge Builders, bringing people together in a polarized age. I wrote it because I believe that as a journalist, I do have a role to play in trying to address this crisis of divisiveness, which is why the title of this event today is so key. It's so appropriate to call it Storytellers, because as journalists, we can use stories to help bring communities together. And it's about covering conflict in a different way. It's about covering that conflict at that gravel quarry, those debates, as a young journalist, that I saw, in a way that can provide solutions and tell the community how other people have addressed these sorts of things. Because we know that conflict is key to a democracy, but it's also important that we prevent that fire from becoming a fire that destroys our democracy. So, America, in the end, I feel is like this one big dysfunctional family, that it's better off when we're communicating more effectively and we're talking to each other, because we know that we have to do that to move forward. And I hope that as a professional communicator, I can play a small role in improving those lines of communication. Thanks so much.
Nate, thank you so much. I so appreciate you kicking off our show with such an encouraging and thoughtful message.
Thank you so much, Megan. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Also, Nate is not shamelessly here to plug his book, but if you check our chat, we have some links in there. We can learn more about Nate. And I think this is your third book. So congratulations on that.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. This is always a really powerful show for us to put on, because we know that lots of people talk about journalists behind our back, sometimes in front of our face, but journalists don't often talk about themselves. So we really appreciate you tuning in. And I really want to thank my colleagues for volunteering to do this. It takes a little bit of vulnerability that journalists don't often show. We talk about you and other people, but we don't usually talk about ourselves. So we're always really passionate about this Stories About Stories show. It always marks our anniversary. This is the 5th year we're national, and it's the 10th year that we've actually been running the show in Phoenix. So shout out to Greg. Thanks so much for representing my home newsroom, the Arizona Republic, in tonight's show. We also want to give a shout out to our national presenting sponsor, Humana. They have stuck with us, as I mentioned at the top of the show, during this virtual season, because they believe that fundamentally sharing stories and connecting as humans, online or in person, makes for healthier people and healthier communities. Humana is really putting, they're frankly putting their money where our mouths are and where our storytellers' mouths are, because they feel like we really need these connections to each other and to our health now more than ever. So again, they want us to remind you, as COVID-19 vaccinations are available in communities across the country, Humana encourages you to consider getting vaccinated and to talk to your doctor about that and figure out what's right for you, what's available in your region. If you want to learn more about what they're doing to support good health and good communities across the country, you can go to humana.com. But we just really say thanks so much for being there for us. Humana's support of the show allows us to bring you this live journalism. Now I'd like to bring up our colleague Annabelle, who's going to talk to us a little bit about her journalism career, food, and a secret identity. Take it away.
Thank you so much, Megan. Yeah, and I used to talk about bridge building, and that's food is one way of doing that, and that's where I come in. So yeah, I spent 15 years pretending to be a white guy. To put it a little more precisely, I spent 15 years pretending to be a French white guy. During that time, I wrote restaurant reviews, under the pseudonym Jean LeBouf. It's a pretty silly name if you think about it, Jean the Beef, but it wasn't my idea necessarily. Back in 1979, one of my predecessors, Bob Morris, came up with the name. He was basically looking for a way to take his wife on more dates and figured he should have the news press pay for it. So he came up with this fake name, this fancy sounding French name, in order to take his wife out. And that went pretty well for him for several years. Fast forward to me taking over the name, and I basically just saw it as a really good place to hide. I had, at the time, was dropping out of medical school and was working in restaurants as a line cook, and was asked to review restaurants for the newspaper. And I figured, yeah, let's hide. Let's pretend like someone else is writing this stuff. I was in my early 20s, and at the time, I felt like a fraud, and I wanted a hiding place. Growing up in Fort Myers, Florida, and Robert E. Lee County, there weren't many hiding places. I was a half Filipino kid, half white, and I really didn't fit in. I remember going to the doctor's office with my mom when we were little, and they'd have the little boxes where it was, black, no, white, no, Hispanic, no, and we would check the other, and that was me. I was the other. In our family, my mom was the cook, and my dad was really the gourmand, the fancy guy. He's the one who introduced me to Jean LaBouffe back in the day. Every Friday, the restaurant reviews would come out on the back page of the features section, and my dad would grab it, and I'd take the comics, and he'd read through and see what Jean LaBouffe wrote that week. And if it was good, he'd pin it to the fridge, and if it was bad, he'd throw it in the garbage. So maybe 7 or 8 years old, he took us down 30 minutes south of here to Naples, Florida, to go to this restaurant that had been rated a perfect 4 stars by Monsieur LaBouffe. And we get there, and my mom's in jean shorts, and we're in like little sundresses and things like that. And we get to the door, and the maitre d' comes out in this nice vest and this perfect little mustachio. And he goes to my father and says, "I'm so sorry, we do not allow children in this restaurant, sir." And my dad was like, "But I just read the review, and Jean LaBouffe didn't mention that." So, we ended up not eating there. I'm pretty sure we ate Arby's, like driving in the Volkswagen on the way home. It didn't work out. When I was 9, my dad died, and that was kind of the end of our little Jean LaBouffe adventures. Honestly, I don't think I thought about Jean LaBouffe again for several years. The next time it kind of came up was when I was working in restaurants, and I was working in a restaurant that was reviewed by Jean LaBouffe. And I remember when the review came out, kind of sitting it on the pass, and all of us huddled around there looking at it, trying to figure out, who was the server that day, who made the chowder, who could have helped this person, like who could it have been? And it was just this mystery, and nobody knew. And just being in that being mentioned in that review felt like I was part of local history. I never, in my wildest dreams, imagined I'd actually be writing those reviews one day. So in the restaurant world, I started as a prep cook. I worked my way up to line cook. I started working for a catering company, and this was the mid-2000s. And I got a big head and figured, yeah, I could have my own catering company. Why not? We did breakfast and lunch gigs here in Southwest Florida, which in the mid-2000s, it was mostly mortgage brokers and title companies, because we were awash in mortgage brokers and title companies in the mid-2000s. But, I wasn't really making any money. So I decided to take a night job, and I found one at the news press. I was what they called back then an agate clerk, which is a job that does not exist anymore today. And what I did was I would take shuffleboard scores from the RV park leagues and hole-in-one roundups from the country clubs, and I would type them up and put them in this little tiny, like 5.5-point font on the back page of the sports section next to the NHL roundups and the MLB roundups and things like that. And that was my job. Over time, I got some stories handed to me, and I did okay with them, and I won some awards, and I became a sports writer. And this is, 2004, 2005. I sat next to the boating writer. I was across from the golf writer, down the way from the fishing writer. So that was the state of journalism in the mid-2000s. I remember just faking it. I didn't know a ton about sports, but I had access to Google, and we had good internet at the news press. And I remember one day hearing these kind of 6 magical words just like float their way through the newsroom, and it was, "We need a new restaurant critic." And I remember being like, that would make a lot more sense. Like, restaurants, you've worked in restaurants, you've cooked before. That would make a lot of sense. They needed a new Jean LaBouffe, and I loved Jean LaBouffe. I clamored for it. I was like, "Please pick me, take me. I want to do this." I felt like a complete fraud in sports, but food, I kind of understood. I became the full-time food writer in 2011, and it was a great time. I got to kind of, envision this coverage in my hometown of this topic that I loved. And fast forward 12, 13 years, I'm kind of in the swing of things, and we're sitting at a little taqueria, one of my favorite little spots in San Carlos Park. We just brought on another restaurant critic to write under the Jean LaBouffe name. She and I are having lunch. We just sent her up to a food journalism conference up in South Carolina, and she's kind of reporting back to me on what happened. And she says, "You will not believe what they said when I told them that we write under a fake name. I mean, my tacos." And I'm like, what did they say? And she's like, They were aghast, Annabelle. And I was like, huh? Aghast, she said, just, completely mortified. And I kind of let it sink in for a second. And I was like, but did they tell them that we're Jean LaBeouf? Like, did you explain to them how important Jean LaBeouf is to this area and what an icon he is? And she's like, no, they called it career suicide, that we're absolutely doing the wrong thing. So I digest this, if you will, and come home and do my own research, get my laptop open. And I kind of knew, just as a journalist, I knew that this wasn't really above the line. But like I said, it's Jean LaBeouf, and it's kind of a local thing. That's what we do. I looked up the first rule of the Code of Ethics for the Association of Food Journalists, and it read, critics and reporters shall write under their real names. And I was like, well, that's rule 1, okay? I kept the JLB name because I thought it was a very selfless act. I thought that by writing under this fake name and going to restaurants, I was experiencing the same service, I was getting the same food, I was having the exact same experience that anybody else going to that place would have. But in this small town of ours, over the years, that kind of hiding spot gets really, really tiny. It doesn't take a lot to connect the dots that the one food writer at the news press might also be the restaurant critic. And I kind of realized that it was no longer this selfless act, that it was just me trying to hide still. I went through these years from being a 20-something restaurant critic to being a 30-something-year-old restaurant critic to now a barely 40-year-old one with 2 kids. At some point, my son came up to me recently and was like, Mom, you're like Clark Kent and Jean LaBeouf is like Superman. You're like a superhero. I don't think I've ever been as proud as a mother as I was in that moment. Like, it's really cool to be a superhero. That's one thing. It's being able to tell people like what restaurants to go to and have them listen is a pretty cool superpower. But more than that, I liked getting the emails that were addressed to Dear Sir or Dear Monsieur or Dear Mr. LaBeouf. Because it's one thing to be a superhero, but it's something even more powerful to be a white guy. So I convinced myself that I really needed this name to be taken seriously. And we talked in the past about getting rid of Jean LaBeouf, us in the editorial team. And I kind of fought it back then, but now I was realizing that we didn't have to get rid of him. We just kind of had to scoot him over a little bit to make some room in the Cape for myself and the other restaurant critics that we were bringing online. So February 4th of this year, I wrote an essay revealing myself as Jean LaBeouf. And I think it posted at 11 a.m. that morning. And as journalists tend to do, I kind of just stared at the screen, refreshing it, just waiting for, the response to come in. And honestly, I was terrified. I was convinced that the world was going to come after me for killing JLB, this beloved local legend. I think the first email came through at like 11:09 a.m. and then a second one pinged in, and a third one, and a 40th one, and a 50th one. And really unanimously, they said the same thing. Thank you, which wasn't what I was expecting. And I remember kind of just staring at my laptop through like this sheet of tears and kind of realizing that like for the first time in my journalism career, I didn't feel like a fraud, that I didn't feel like an imposter or a fake, that I felt like I belonged here and that this is exactly the place I was meant to be. Thank you so much.
Yo, thank you, Annabelle. That was so. When you said that you felt like an other and actually had to check the box that said other, I said, wow, I felt like that way a lot in my life. And I imagine that that's resonated with a lot of other people, but for you to have to put it down. And then furthermore, part of the reason I'm a journalist is because my dad loved a columnist in our hometown paper. And I kind of wanted to be like him.
Yes.
Oddly enough, in trying to write like him, I too was pretending to be an old white guy. So
that was the voice that I like heard in my head writing for so long, was just like, pretend you're 70 and that, you've been at these Michelin restaurants and that you really know all this stuff.
Well, listen, thank you so much for that story. And listen, everybody, don't be scared to throw some applause out there. Hit like, hit some buttons, tap some stuff, but show her that you appreciated what she just gave to us. Now, with that said, I'd like to bring up our next storyteller. Dana, take it away.
Thank you so much. So my name is Dana Benbow, and I'm a sports writer with the Indianapolis Star. So I'm basically the writer who loves to find a guy who's been to 70 straight Indianapolis 500s or a woman who's made it to like 10,000 high school games. I like trying to find college athletes with kind of an offbeat story. I once actually wrote about a woman, a defensive end for a college football team who was blind in one eye. So I write about former NFL quarterbacks who are in prison. And if anybody in the sports world dies, I am basically the one that editors call on to write the obituary. So I'm kind of that used to the human interest, kind of used to the sad. But this story about Chase and Sadie was different for me. It was devastating and heart-wrenching and beautiful and happy and sad. It was everything life can throw at you at once. So it started last spring during the height of the pandemic. I was scrolling through Facebook and I saw a wedding video had been posted by a local nurse at a children's hospital here in Indianapolis. And so I would usually scroll right past that. But I noticed like the comments were really off for a wedding. People were saying it was unfair and devastating. And so I clicked on the video to see what I could see. And the only way I can describe what I saw was mysterious. Like it was beautiful, but it was something was looming. Like the bride and groom were very, very young and people seemed like they were happy, but maybe not. And then at the end, as the video ended, and it was like 15 minutes long, the bride and groom walked away into the darkness. And as the camera shot them from behind, I remember thinking like the groom had looked so young in the video, but the way his body moved was like an old man. So I picked up my phone and I called the local hospital. I had no idea. It was like a shot in the dark, but I thought maybe they'll know this story about this couple that their nurse posted about. And unbelievably, they did. But that was because Chase, who was the groom, had just been in their hospital 4 days before. And he had been told he had 3 to 5 months to live. His Ewing sarcoma that he had been battling for 6 years was back, and it had attacked everywhere in his body, his lungs, his back, his head. And he was in love with Sadie. She was his high school sweetheart. They were both seniors in high school, and he wanted to marry her and spend the last 3 to 5 months he had left with her. So I wanted to write this story. So I told the hospital, is there any way you can get me in touch with them? And the answer was yes. So Chase was in the sports world. He was on track to be an Olympic swimmer. He was number 2 in the nation in the the 100-meter butterfly. And his wife, Sadie, was an elite diver who was headed to a Division I college. So they were both athletes. But this story was going to be different for me. And basically, it went crazy. It struck a nerve. So it was 2 young people in love and running out of time. And it was something maybe during COVID that people needed or was touching them in a way that they didn't know. I had emails from England, China, Australia. People all over the world were writing me saying they'd seen the story. All sorts of outlets picked it up. They were on Inside Edition, the Today Show, People Magazine. The first time I ever met them, I had to wait while they did an interview with Inside Edition. Actually, it wasn't the first time I met them, but the second time I went back to see them. But basically, they were stealing my story, and I felt really envious. So I was like, this is my story. This is my couple, and I felt protective of them. So I really wanted to follow them through their journey of settling into this new marriage as they battled terminal cancer. But there were 2 people I had to get approval from, my editors and Chase. So my editors, I remember being super nervous as I mumbled through the question of like asking the editor if I could do this. And she set up a meeting with editors above her. And in the end, they said, yes, follow them through the raw moments, follow them through the everyday moments, be where they are, travel with them. basically be there till the end. And it was an end no one really thought would end very well. But the next question I had to do was get Chase's approval. And he was 18. He was an adult. He was married. But I have 3 teenage sons, so I know they're not really adults. So I went to his mom, Kelly, first. And I remember being scared as I talked to her and tried to explain what I wanted to do. And she didn't answer me at first. She said she wanted to talk to Chase and Sadie. And so I waited for her call. And the next day I was in a McDonald's drive-thru. I'll never forget. I was sitting there when the text came in and she said, Chase said yes. And then she said, actually, Chase said, let's do this. So here I was, so excited. I couldn't believe I had this story in my hands, but then I was also very scared because this was a really precious story. And it was a story that I had no idea how precious it would be to me. It was something that would change my life forever. So basically the next weeks were spent going to doctor's visits, hospitals. I traveled to Cleveland as he got radiation on his tumors in his head, the pool where he swam for comfort, family gatherings. And the more that I was with them, it was just unreal the way Chase behaved. I was like, his life is ending and he seems happy. Although I do remember the time that he had found out his cancer had spread even more and the treatment wasn't working. And I had to ask to come over to their house that day within like minutes of them getting home. And they said yes. But when I got there, he was upstairs. He never came down. But his mom did. And she sat in tears telling me how unfair this was and how she wished she could change everything. But I remember saying to her, yes, but he is teaching people something because he was so positive and he was so happy. I mean, I can remember him in Cleveland being excited that they had chocolate milk. And I can remember him cracking up as his new English Bulldog's puppy would like do something crazy. And I can just remember all the things that made him so happy. And yet I was like consumed by death. The more I covered him, the more my mortality hit me. I thought about death nonstop. It didn't matter if I was making pancakes, I was crying or thinking about dying. If I was watching Family Feud, I was thinking about Chase. It did not matter what I was doing. This story, he was so ingrained in me, Chase was, that I couldn't separate him from me. And so it was a hot, sunny day last June when my dryer broke down and I was out hanging laundry on the fence when I reached up to my neck and I felt 2 huge lumps. And I remember my heart sank and I thought, Chase, this must be how he feels. I mean, I was sure I had cancer. And I called my best friend and I told her, I just can't imagine me getting cancer while I'm covering Chase. And then I thought, well, maybe he was put in my life to teach me how to die. I went to the doctor and they told me to give it time. It was probably swollen lymph nodes and they would go down. Now, this story isn't about me dying. They're gone now. But at the time, I 100% thought for sure that I was gone. I can't even explain how consumed I was with Chase that I felt this connection and I thought for sure I knew what he was going through. So a month later from that, I drove to Florida. Chase and Sadie were going there for what they thought would be their last time at the beach. And I remember just this gloom over me. The lumps were still there. I listened to John Green's A Fault in Our Stars, which is a tragic novel about a young woman who has terminal cancer and her boyfriend. It was basically the opposite of Chase and Sadie. And when I got to the beach, it was sunny. Sadie was out there with her family. Chase was nowhere to be found. He was up in the beach house. And that's where he spent a lot of that vacation. He was so tired and he was in so much pain. And that night in my hotel room alone, I woke up in the middle of the night and I was drenching in sweat. And I reached up to feel the lumps and they seemed the size of golf balls at that time. And I started crying and Googling, and I was willing Google to tell me it was something it wasn't, at least not what I thought it was. But Google kept saying, metastatic cancer that spread throughout your body, like the clavicle whatevers mean the body's spreading through the cancer spreading through your body. And I just remember laying there in bed shaking and thinking about Chase and wondering if he was in his bed, shaking just like I was down the road. So the more we got back from Florida and the months went on, and I was with them so much, I, felt like they were my family. I remember thinking that I was probably writing things that were really hard for them to read. And so I had a conversation that I know they had agreed to do this, but it wasn't a contract. So if they ever wanted me to leave or get out or stop, I would. They never asked me to leave. I finally went to the hospital and got my masses checked out, and they came back as what they called them the left I can't remember, clavicular X and B, or I don't know, but they were basically lymph nodes filled with infection, and NED, which means no evidence of disease. And I only knew that acronym because Chase had talked to me about it so much, about the times he had been NED, and then it came back and how much he wanted to hear those letters again. So in March of this spring, I wrote Kelly, his mother. I had had a really real dream about Chase being a college swimmer and me following him and covering him as a reporter. And she said, "Oh, I so wish that could be the case. He wanted that so badly." Well, the next text I got from Kelly was April 3rd. And that was a text I will never forget. It said, "Dana, I just wanted you to know we're going to lose Chase today or tomorrow. I know you loved him." So I sat in shock because this was what the story had been about, following him through his journey. But now we were at the end, and I had never thought about what to do at the end. Do I ask to go there as he dies? And my gut said no. In my gut, I wanted them to be there with him and say their goodbyes without me hovering over them. And so the journalist in me vanished, and I stayed home. And Chase died the next morning. It was Easter Sunday, and he was a devout Christian. That was a big part of his legacy, was spreading his faith. So it made perfect sense that he had died on Easter Sunday morning. Chase did not live 3 to 5 months. He lived 11 months. He died 3 weeks short of his and Sadie's 1-year wedding anniversary. He taught me so much in those 11 months. He taught me how to live. He changed my outlook on life and death. I don't worry about dying anymore, which is weird for someone like me because I always did. I don't worry about little things like when my sons were inside and broke a picture the other day playing football. And I don't worry about big things like how much time do I have left? What I learned from being with Chase is that the very worst thing that can happen is you die. But before you do, you have to live. Thank you.
Oh my gosh, Dana, thank you so much for telling your story. Thank you for sharing about yourself. You must still think about him all the time.
Yes. And I still talk to Sadie, and yes. So yeah. And I have 3 teenage sons, and one's exactly his age. So it's it was so real. Yeah.
Oh my gosh. But I want to say, it came through in your reporting, and I wanted to say thank you for telling us this story, but mostly thank you for telling it in the first place and following their story all the way through.
Thank you.
Yeah. If you're interested in reading Dana's story or following it, we are putting it in the chat. It's live in the comments. But I also want to just say, Dana's story, one of the reasons we try to share stories like this with you is because not everybody understands, why do we tell the stories of people who are going through these things? Because sometimes people I think they don't understand, why would you bother people when they're going through such a hard time? And I feel very grateful to Dana for helping explain. Our audiences care about these people. They're rooting for these people. Often our readers donate money, they donate time, they pray. They commit to spiritual acts for some of the people that we write about. We've written stories and then had people, come together in prayer on behalf of this person we wrote for, or certainly donate money to nonprofits or try to support a family through a hard time. But we write these stories because we know that you never know if you're going to be in that position someday. And it can make you feel very alone. And one of the roles of journalists is to write stories to make people feel less alone. And so I really think that Dana's story is an example of that. So many of us have our lives touched by cancer, but each of us goes through these things alone. And it can remind us we're not alone if we read about others who are living through these things in print or online. So That's why we tell these stories. I'm a little teared up. It was obviously a really intense story. With that, I'd like to bring up our next storytellers. Xerxes and Jared are here to talk about a very different kind of journalism. So we're going to take a big deep breath and have kind of like a little bit of a cleansing moment, because they're going to talk about really hard-hitting investigative journalism and what it means to do that work and why our newsrooms are relentlessly committed to it. And with that, I will hand it over to you guys. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I'm going to talk to you guys about a story that has been kind of a long-running focus for myself and the newspaper here. It started the morning of February 1st, 2017, when prisoners wearing masks used makeshift weapons and coordinated violence to take control of a building C, at Delaware's largest prison. 3 correctional officers and a counselor were taken hostage that morning. I was here at my desk in the newsroom that morning when my colleague across the cubicle got a phone call, and her voice quickly became frantic. She was on the phone with hostages and hostage takers, and they wanted her to communicate their demands. Things like additional educational opportunities, more fair treatment in the prison's kind of busted grievance system, and just generally a greater focus on rehabilitation in lieu of punishment. Now, it's not uncommon for bad things to happen in prison, but it's rare for kind of the people that we all, whether we realize it or not, pay tax dollars toward imprisoning, turn the tables entirely and demand a minute of our attention. I remember sitting here thinking at the time, like, wow, I wish that phone call would have come to my telephone. But I realize now that was really naive, because what was happening on the other end of the line was life and death for the people there.
The standoff that followed between the police and between inmates lasted 18 hours. Over that time, 2 officers would be released in negotiations for things like turning on the telephones. Shortly before sunrise the following morning, a backhoe breached the barricaded door of the prison, and dozens of police officers flooded in, meeting no serious resistance. Police came in and rescued the counselor, who had been kept safe by prisoners, other hostages themselves. But they also found the body of Officer Stephen Floyd, a father, a husband, and a veteran of corrections who was brutally murdered and bled to death. This ended the first chapter of a story that would change lives, bring reforms to Delaware and to its prison system, and at the end of the day, leave many, many questions unanswered about what happened and how it happened that day.
So a year later, I'm in the courthouse working there, and the state prosecutors are beginning to put together and try to hold 16 different men accountable for Sergeant Floyd's murder, as well as orchestrating this takeover. Most of those men maintained their innocence. Some admitted their role in the events of that day, represented themselves at trial, and tried to turn the state's pursuit of justice into their own kind of protest against what they see as injustice in lockup in Delaware. These trials were as dramatic as anything you would ever see on television. There were no security cameras in the building where this occurred, so prosecutors had to rely on a line of inmate witnesses, men who were in the building at the time and not involved, who were pointing to who they believed were involved. So you had situations where prisoners were testifying against their former cellmates, against their former friends. You had people that evidence indicated might have been involved in the planning, who are now turning against those that were involved in testifying. You also had news just kind of trickling out naturally from the testimony of government officials that had never spoken publicly about the situation. And ultimately, after a series of very long trials, only those who admitted their role were convicted by a jury. Now, to many, this was seen as a significant failure and impunity for those who killed the correctional officer and carried this out. And by then, the state had issued some reports and said they had fixed the problems, and the state's attention just kind of waned.
Since the protest, our newspaper has published tens of thousands of words. Xerxes has sat through hours of interviews and testimony. But after all of that, questions still remained unanswered. One of them was it true that the governor had vetoed a plan to burst into the prison early on, perhaps before Officer Floyd would have bled out? Another question was, why was warning sign after warning sign ignored by those in charge of the prison? And a very serious question was, if this truly was a protest, why did Officer Floyd die when all the other hostages lived? We also knew that the department had its own secret report that had not been released to the public. And with these questions in mind, we stayed on the story.
So that involved, like, this has been kind of a focus for a couple of years now. And, you know, it'd spend weekly, sometimes multiple times a week, going into the prison, sitting across the plexiglass wall from men who were in that building at the time, who were sharing with us what happened leading up to it, what happened that day, and how they felt about everything that has come after. It also involves speaking to the men who admitted responsibility in this whole thing. You know, they have always maintained that this was a protest and that their motivations were just, but it is inescapable that murder also occurred there. And it was jarring, but eventually I got one of the men to kind of open up about why Officer Floyd was killed and the other officers were allowed to live. Ultimately, he said that the officer's actions over the years and his interactions made him a target. And, you know, whoever was in control, whichever prisoners were in control of the hostage situation as it occurred, nobody could stop what ultimately happened to him. And I still spend a lot of time thinking about that, and I still find it kind of jarring. But we also talked to one of the men who was labeled as prosecutors as kind of the mastermind of this whole thing. He went to trial, and a jury found him not guilty, although the evidence against him was fairly strong. I remember, you know, sitting across from him in a coffee shop and thinking like how I would have voted had I been on his jury. And I don't know the answer to that. But through the court proceedings, he was able to get that secret report we mentioned earlier and ultimately shared it with me. That report included direct input on how the officer who was killed that day had warned his superiors that peaceful protests in the building were eventually going to become violent. And it also included direct input from people managing the prison about why that message fell on deaf ears. So I felt like we had a story, but it was still difficult. You know, a lot of people, particularly in government, didn't want us to do this story. They made the point that it could re-traumatize people who were there that day. People high up in state government accused us of giving too much of a platform and listening too much to people who are in prison. But then you also had people like the prison counselor who was a hostage that day and also felt like that the situation deserved a continuing look and felt like our efforts were worthwhile. And like I thought a lot about that, and I take it very seriously. Maybe too seriously, probably not, but it was difficult. But ultimately, like, a lot was made about impunity for those that the state tried to hold responsible for the officer's death. But there's also the question about impunity for those who failed to kind of heed the warning signs, and that created this kind of cauldron that bubbled over ultimately. And I just really think it was necessary for us to try to explain as close as we could to the truth about what happened there that day. And even if that truth involves like painful juxtapositions.
And the reality is that this story is just full of those difficult juxtapositions. We have a man who was brutally murdered, an officer who was brutally murdered amidst a protest that at the end of the day was over prison conditions that now looking back, everybody realizes needed improving, not just for the inmates, but also for those that have to work there and for their safety. Since then, the state has spent millions trying to rectify those issues, and we just felt that readers deserved to know as much as we could tell them about that day. And the reality is, as long as we work for this newspaper, we'll probably still be telling this story because it continues to reverberate throughout our community. A lot was said about holding Officer Floyd's murderers accountable, but we also believe that those responsible for housing the state's most dangerous, but also the state's most vulnerable residents, must be held accountable when things go horribly wrong. When something happens in a prison, it's easy to chalk it up to bad people doing bad things to other bad people, but we all sign off on how our government treats people in prison. We vote for politicians and elect them who make decisions about policies. We actively fund it with our taxes. And while reasonable people may disagree on what justice looks like, we hope that stories like this make it clear that there is blame to share.
So regarding impunity, there's still something that like bobbles around my head regularly to this day about this situation. Back on February 1st, actually the morning of February 2nd, when police retook the building, they didn't meet any resistance, but prisoners there, some of those people who they didn't have anything to do, they were kind of passengers in this whole situation, claimed that they were beaten as they were taken out of the building. And then in lawsuits and in letters and in interviews, prisoners say that in the months after, correctional officers tortured them using dogs, pepper spray, sexual assault, in a way of, they assume, exacting some sort of revenge. Now, there has been no government report. There has been no legal outcome that has addressed the idea that government officials, like the prisoners that staged the riot, lashed out, unseen behind the walls of the prison and outside the acceptable mechanics or our accepted mechanics of justice. And there are people who signed off on whatever happened in the prisons in the months after, who still work in government and still make decisions relevant to crime and punishment in Delaware. So as lawsuits spawn depositions and maybe time brings more candor from people, we're going to continue to watch this, because I feel like understanding why and how something awful happened is the first step toward making sure it does not happen again. Thank you for listening.
Thank you.
That's tough stuff, fellas. Thank you for being a watchdog. You got to take care of the least of these, right? Like, it's not always about writing about the people that we expect to be reading about. Sometimes it's about others. And this one gets confusing because some good guys are bad guys. And then thank you for sticking with it. Thank you for not letting government officials bully you into silence. Thank you for being journalists. And thank you for sharing your story of how we got here.
Thanks for listening.
And thanks for having us.
All right, everybody, deep breath time, right? That was a rough one, an important one. We're going to bring up our next teller. It'll be Noelle, who's talking about writing in the community that they grew up in.
Hi, I'm Noelle Lynn Smith, and I work at the Farmington Daily Times in Farmington, New Mexico. I'm going to introduce myself in the Navajo traditional way. Yat e she Noelle Lynn Smith. Hananathli nishle hashklishni bashishchin. Topahe deshache ma edeshkij deshanale. That is how I identify myself as a Dene woman. We do this to develop a relationship between each other, and also to recognize where we're coming from through our clans that we are born for through our mother, born into through our mother and born for through our father, and then recognizing our maternal grandfather and our paternal grandfather. These 4 clans make us who we are as individuals. So I have been working for the Daily Times for almost 8 years. I am one of 2 Native American journalists in our newsroom. The other reporter is Navajo, and he covers courts and crime, but I cover the Navajo Nation. And I see my role in our community as important because I come from the tribe that I write about. And I think that gives me a different insight into stories because I can relate to the tribal membership a bit more accurately than other reporters. So there's a small percentage of us working in newsrooms, but we're there. And I got my start through the Navajo Times, which is the paper that's based in Window Rock, which is the capital of the Navajo Nation. And that newsroom is fun because there's a lot of majority of them are Navajos, and we're all churning out stories about the Navajo Nation. So if you ever have time, look up their website as well as ours. Anyway, so one question I usually get from non-journalists is, how do I cover tribes? And for me, I think that the basis is understanding tribal sovereignty, that we as Native Americans have a government-to-government relationship with the federal government, and that we have our own laws and codes that we have established as our governments have been forming, from the traditional system to, I guess you would say, like a kind of like the colonized point of view. So for Navajo Nation, that's a 3-branch system that was adopted between 1989 and 1990. So I always think that's important to know if you're going to cover tribes. The other thing is just being cool about it, going out there and talking to people like any other story you're covering. For me, it's been an interesting journey because the few reporters that were in my position before me were non-Navajo. So sometimes when I go out to the communities, people will say, "Oh, I've seen your name in the paper. I thought you were, an Anglo woman." And I'm like, "No, I'm Navajo." And of course, they ask me what my clans are and where I'm coming from. And so I tell them that background. And they always seem like they're really excited about it, that I'm Navajo and I'm writing about our people. And that helps me because it helps, I develop relationships in all these communities because my area of coverage is pretty extensive. I can travel up to an hour or 2 just to go to an event or to cover something that might be happening in a community, which I don't mind doing because it takes me out of the newsroom. But anyway, but it also helps me develop these relationships that I carry throughout my years of reporting. For example, when we had the Gold King mine spill back in August 2015, what happened there was contractors for the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency were doing work at an abandoned mine site up by Silverton, Colorado, and they triggered a blast. And what happened was all this toxic mine waste leaked into a tributary of the Animas River, which flows into the San Juan River and outside of Farmington, and then San Juan eventually goes into the Colorado River and then down the watershed in our western area. So the San Juan River travels through the Navajo Nation. So they had to shut down, because this happened in the summer, they had to shut down irrigation. And the city of Farmington closed their head gates to keep the drinking water safe, which supplies the chapter communities along the river going from Farmington into Shiprock. But one thing that was concerning for a lot of the residents, aside from lack of water to irrigate crops, was lack of water to feed livestock. So there's this tribal enterprise called Navajo agricultural products industry, and they told some of the local chapters, you can come and get water from us because we get water from Navajo Dam, which is located located above the area that was where the contaminated water had flowed into. So I got the photographer at that time to go with me, and we followed a group from Shiprock as they went from this big agricultural site to deliver livestock or water for livestock in these residencies outside of Shiprock. And the community members I talked to, I was like, why was it important, to get water? And they were like, it's for the livestock. My livestock's important to me. It's my way of life. I want my livestock to have water. And I was like, well, what about your household? Are you worried about, water for yourself? But the answer again was, I'm putting my personal value over below my true value, which is my livestock, making sure my livestock gets water. But I didn't see like that angle being taken from some of the other stories I was seeing about the mine spill. Yes, I know the mine spill was important, but it was also important to get that community angle. So I had that insight. So I knew who to reach out to make the arrangements to travel along with this group and get in there and talk to the people about, why was it important to get water to their livestock? So, and then recently with COVID, it was the same thing again, going into the communities, talking to people I know to develop relations and figure out the mindset of people as they dealt with this pandemic, and bringing that, showing that effort at the local level to address this situation that was happening, because a lot of the resources was, not there at the ready, because a lot of these tribal members have to travel, an hour or two just to go to a nearby urban area to go shop at Walmart or to go to the grocery store. And, at the time they're being told that it's the safest place is home. So how do you get the resources to them? How do you get food and water and personal safety supplies? And so we had these grassroots groups doing their best to bring in those supplies because they knew what the needs were, because like me, they were coming from the Navajo community. So, but throughout one thing I was asked, I think, was if I ever kind of had an aha moment, like when did I knew I wanted to become a journalist and come home to report about my people? Well, I don't think I really had an aha moment. It was just something like I knew I wanted to do, but I wanted to develop the skills to do it. So I took this fellowship program for journalists, and that took me to newsrooms in Houston and Seattle and Midland, Michigan. But all the back of my mind, I was like, building my journalism toolbox, because I knew I was going to come home and do stories, because I knew there were stories out there, and that it was important as a Navajo to write about, the Navajo point of view. And to me, that builds an informed society. And an informed society carries a greater strength. So that's how I just kind of started my path. And it's just been carrying me throughout my career. And that's what I really enjoy. It's just, going out and talking to the people. And for me, it also develops my personal side. I learn about our traditions. I learn about our language. I learn about our culture. I learn about, the stories of our 4 sacred mountains, especially with the struggle of protecting the San Francisco Peaks out in Flagstaff, Arizona. I remember I was covering a protest there once, and I talked to this one Navajo elder. And he's like, what was your clans? So I told him, I am Hananathli, and I'm born for Hashglishi. And he was like, do you know those are part of the 4 original clans? I did not know that. So he told me the story of how the 4 original clans were created. And I walked away thinking like, wow, that's pretty cool. I have, my first 2 clans are the original ones. And like I said, I didn't know that story. And he, as an elder, instilled that teaching in me. And that's what I like about my job, is just coming across, other tribal members and just learning from them, and learning our stories and our ways. And that I sometimes, I will maybe reflect it in a story, but most of the times I just keep it within me, because it, it helps me understand my life as a Dene woman. So, but like I said, I think being a Native journalist and being part of a small group is an interesting ride too. I mean, I work closely with some other Native journalists and outside of our publication, and we talk about stories that we're working on, or if we need help, with a resource. Because my specialty is the tribal government. I mean, I have a mentor in that, and her name is Marley Shabala, and she's been covering Navajo Nation news for more than 30 years. And so if I have a question about tribal government or the history, I talk to her on it, and I do my own research. And I pass along my teachings to some of the up and coming Navajo journalists in other newsrooms. And they'll ask me, like, why is it this way? Why is it that way? And I'll say, well, this is what I know. Or, look in the Navajo Nation Code at this title, and this is what, this is the government side of it. Or if you want to reach out to one of the council delegates, this is who to talk to. Or, I heard this in the committee meeting. This is, kind of related to the issue you're covering. So we band together and we, get our stories out there. And because we all think it's important to us, because, we're less than 1% of Native Americans working in newsrooms across the country. And we're telling stories from our communities because, like I said, we feel like it's important, especially carrying our point of view from understanding our fellow tribal members' point of view and delivering it there. So, but that is my story, and thank you for listening.
Oh my gosh, Noelle, thank you so much for your story. Thank you for your journalism. Thank you for sharing your heart with us. We so appreciate you coming to us today. Also, we want to shout out your mom.
Oh, thanks.
Your mom's house today.
I will tell her. I think she was glad to have me home these past 2 days, and I've been eating pretty good.
That was. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your work and for really reflecting on how much it matters that our newsrooms are inclusive and representative, that we know our communities and can reflect them, not just with our skills, but also with our hearts. So thank you so much for that reminder and that work.
Well, thank you for allowing me to participate and inviting me to participate.
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much, Noelle. I want to take just a tiny second to thank Fairytale Brownies. They also, if you can hear that, that's George. He kind of missed his nap today. We're just keeping it real here. Fairytale Brownies started out, they've been sponsoring us since 2014, and they started out on a kindergarten playground where their co-founders, David and Eileen, met, and they have been literally friends and work partners since then. They even partnered on projects in high school, they said, but nothing has been as successful as their business, Fairytale Brownies. In the normal times, they send brownies to all of our subscribers in the real world at shows. They could be big, giant brownies. But now they're just sending boxes of brownies to all of our storytellers during this inside time still. But they own, they just wanted you to know that they have a shop really here in Phoenix that is filled with real people who make awesome brownies, 37,000 square feet, where they bake, package, and ship more than 6 million brownies and cookies a year. They are incredible, and they're on a mission truly to bring joy and spread smiles. They support storytellers because they know that stories are how we share our values. So whether that's a fairy tale, a myth, or just a family legend, they are here for it. If you want to spread some brownie joy this summer, they're giving away 2 Fairytale dozen gifts. That's a special gift pack. And if you want, we're putting it in the chat. You can go to brownies.com. You can sign up by using a link to Storytellers. We're putting it in the chat, and we'll also send it to you in the post-event email. But thank you so much to Fairytale Brownies for supporting us. With that, I want to bring up all of our storytellers and Greg, and I want to say thank you to everybody for being here. So Noelle and Annabelle, Xerxes, thank you, Dana. Thank you, Jared. Oh my gosh, we are lucky to have you, Nathan. Greg, thank you for being on tonight's show. My last thing, I want to say to everyone, thank you so much for representing the USA Today Network with all of your heart and all of your talent. Good night, everyone.
You.
Night.
Thanks for the journalism.
Good night.
Bye.
Hi, my name is Teresa. I'm a market point agent for Humana. I help teach people about Medicare, learning about their lives, and showing them how Humana can provide for their healthcare needs. I worked in healthcare for many years and was able to see firsthand the effect insurance has on the care people receive. I wanted to be able to help make that difference. I've been fortunate enough to get to know many memorable people in my job. One person that stands out in particular is Miss W. She had recently moved to Pennsylvania to be closer to her children and needed help finding policy in her new state. I spoke with Miss W and her daughters many times as we worked around eligibility delays related to changing her address. I'm so glad I got to help Miss W settle into her new home here in Pennsylvania. It's just one example of why I feel like I have the best job in the world with Humana.